void stretched out endlessly, a vast expanse of nothingness punctuated by the distant glimmers of dying stars. In this cold, unforgiving darkness, three gods drifted aimlessly, their forms shrouded in a gloom that seemed to consume even the faintest flickers of hope. Tiamat, Ishtar, and Enlil, once proud deities of the divine realm, now cast out into the abyss, banished by Marduk for their defiance. The passage of time was meaningless here, in the void between worlds. It could have been days, since they were expelled from the celestial city. The wounds inflicted by Marduk still ached, both physical and spiritual, but it was the sense of loss that weighed heaviest on their hearts. They had been stripped of everything, home, purpose, honor, and left to wander in the shadows of their former glory. Tiamat, the ancient serpent of the primordial sea, coiled in on herself, her once mighty form diminished by the pain of exile. Her eyes, like twin embers, burned with a smoldering fury that refused to be extinguished. The memory of Marduk's betrayal was a thorn lodged deep in her heart, festering into a desire for revenge that consumed her thoughts. Ishtar floated beside her, her once radiant beauty now shadowed by sorrow. The goddess of love, war, and fertility had been a beacon of life in the divine realm, her presence a force of creation and destruction in equal measure. Now, she was adrift in the void, her passions turned inward, fueling a fire that had no outlet. Enlil, the lord of the winds and storms, was silent, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the void met the edge of the universe. He had been the voice of order, the enforcer of divine law, but now he was a god without a realm, a ruler without subjects. The storm within him was quiet, but it was a quiet that promised violence, a tempest waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. It was Tiamat who finally broke the silence, her voice a low, hissing whisper that cut through the stillness of the void. "We cannot continue like this," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at her companions. "We are gods, yet we drift like lost souls, banished from the realm that should be ours. We must reclaim what has been taken from us." Ishtar turned to her, her gaze filled with a deep, abiding sorrow. "Reclaim what, Tiamat?" she asked softly. "Marduk has cast us out. The divine realm is his now, and there is no place for us there." "No," Tiamat hissed, her eyes flashing with sudden intensity. "Marduk may have cast us out, but we are not defeated. We do not need to return to the divine realm. We can build our own kingdom, a realm that rivals Marduk's, a place where we are the supreme rulers." Enlil's gaze shifted to Tiamat, a flicker of interest lighting his stormy eyes. "A new kingdom," he mused, his voice a deep rumble. "But where? The cosmos is vast, but the realms are already claimed by other gods. If we are to build a new kingdom, we will need to take it by force." A slow, cunning smile spread across Tiamat's lips. "Exactly," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "And I know just the place. The underworld, the realm ruled by Nergal. He is powerful, yes, but he is not invincible. With the three of us united, we can overthrow him and take his kingdom for our own." Ishtar's eyes widened in surprise. "The underworld," she repeated, her voice tinged with doubt. "But Nergal is the god of death and war. His power is great, and he commands legions of divine warriors. How can we hope to defeat him?" Tiamat's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with dark intent. "We will defeat him because we must," she said simply. "We have nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. Nergal's underworld will be the foundation of our new kingdom, and from there, we will rise to challenge Marduk once more." Enlil's gaze darkened, his thoughts turning inward as he considered Tiamat's plan. The prospect of ruling a new kingdom, a realm where he could wield his power without fear of Marduk's wrath, was tempting. And the underworld, with its vast legions and untold secrets, was a prize worth fighting for. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of his decision. "Very well," he said, his voice resolute. "We will take the underworld from Nergal. And when we do, we will carve out a new empire, one that will rival even Marduk's divine realm." Ishtar hesitated, her gaze flickering between Tiamat and Enlil. The thought of facing Nergal in battle filled her with a sense of dread, but she knew that Tiamat was right, they could not remain adrift in the void forever. If they were to survive, they needed a kingdom of their own. With a deep breath, she nodded, her resolve hardening within her. "I am with you," she said quietly. "Let us take the underworld and build a new future." Tiamat's smile was cold and triumphant. "Then it is decided," she said, her voice filled with dark anticipation. "We will strike at dawn, when the shadows are deepest and Nurgle's attention is divided. We will catch him off guard and bring him to his knees." The descent into the underworld. The underworld was a realm of eternal night, a vast, shadowy expanse where the light of the sun had never touched. It was a place of death and decay, where the spirits of the dead wandered aimlessly through the gloom, their whispers a constant murmur in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of rot and earth, and the ground beneath their feet was cold and unyielding, like the surface of a long-forgotten tomb. Tiamat, Ishtar, and Enlil descended into this bleak realm, their forms wreathed in shadow as they made their way through the labyrinthine passages that led to Nurgle's palace. The walls of the underworld were carved from black stone, their surfaces etched with the symbols of death and war. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant wails of the damned, their voices rising and falling like the wind through a desolate graveyard. Tiamat led the way, her eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light as she navigated the twisting corridors. Her serpentine form was coiled and tense, ready to strike at any moment. Ishtar followed close behind, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword, her every sense alert to the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Enlil brought up the rear, his gaze flicking back and forth as he scanned the darkness for any sign of Nurgle's forces. They moved in silence, their presence a ripple in the fabric of the underworld. The spirits of the dead shrank away from them, their hollow eyes filled with a nameless fear as the three gods passed by. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, as they drew closer to Nurgle's throne. Finally, they reached the heart of the underworld, a vast, cavernous chamber where Nurgle's palace loomed like a fortress of night. The palace was a towering structure of black stone, its walls lined with the bones of the fallen, its towers crowned with the skulls of ancient kings. The gates were wrought from iron, their surfaces inscribed with runes of power that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. Tiamat halted before the gates, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the fortress. "This is it," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the gloom. "The seat of Nurgle's power. Once we breach these gates, there will be no turning back." Ishtar nodded, her gaze fixed on the dark towers of the palace. "We will face whatever lies within," she said, her voice steady. "For our new kingdom, for our future." Enlil's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he stepped forward, his hand raised to summon the winds. "Let us begin," he said, his voice a low growl. "The underworld will be ours." With a wave of his hand, Enlil unleashed the full force of the storm, the winds howling as they battered against the iron gates. Lightning flashed across the sky, the bolts striking the gates with a deafening crash, sending sparks flying into the air. The ground trembled beneath the force of the assault, the very walls of the palace shuddering as the winds tore at them. But the gates held firm, the runes of power glowing brighter as they absorbed the energy of the storm. Tiamat hissed in frustration, her eyes narrowing as she watched the gates resist their attack. "We must strike together," she said, her voice cold and determined. "Combine our powers and break through Nurgle's defenses." Ishtar drew her sword, the blade glowing with a fierce, inner light as she summoned the fire of creation. The flames danced along the edge of the blade, their heat searing the air as she raised her weapon high. "Together, then," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Let us shatter these gates and bring Nurgle to his knees." With a roar, the three gods unleashed their combined power upon the gates. Tiamat summoned the waters of chaos, a tidal wave of dark energy that surged forward, crashing against the iron with a force that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality. Ishtar struck with the fire of creation, her blade cleaving through the air as she brought it down upon the gates, the flames roaring with the intensity of a newborn star. Enlil called upon the storm, the winds howling and the lightning flashing as he poured all his strength into the assault. The gates groaned under the pressure, the runes of power flickering as they struggled to contain the onslaught. The iron buckled and warped, the metal screaming as it was torn apart by the sheer force of the attack. Finally, with a resounding crash, the gate shattered, the pieces flying in all directions as the entrance to Nergal's palace was laid bare. Tiamat surged forward, her eyes blazing with triumph as she led the charge into the palace. Ishtar and Enlil followed close behind, their weapons ready, their hearts pounding with the anticipation of battle. They moved through the dark corridors of the palace like a storm, their presence a wave of destruction that left nothing in its wake. The battle in the underworld. Nergal sat upon his throne, his dark eyes fixed on the gates of his palace as they shuddered under the force of the attack. The god of death and war was no stranger to conflict, but the power of the assault that now threatened his domain was unlike anything he had ever faced. The runes of power flickered and dimmed, the gates groaning as they struggled to hold back the onslaught. Finally, with a resounding crash, the gates shattered, and Nergal's palace was breached. He rose from his throne, his scythe in hand, his expression dark and resolute as he prepared to face his enemies. "Tiamat," he growled, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the chamber. "I should have known you would come. You seek to claim my kingdom, but you will find that I am not so easily defeated." From the shadows of the chamber, Nergal's closest allies emerged: Ashur, the relentless warlord; Kali, the fierce goddess of destruction; and Ares, the blood-soaked god of war. They took their places at Nergal's side, their weapons gleaming in the dim light, their expressions cold and determined. Tiamat swept into the chamber, her serpentine form coiled and tense, her eyes blazing with fury. "Nergal," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "This realm will be ours. Stand aside, or be destroyed." Nergal's gaze hardened as he gripped his scythe, the blade glinting with a cold, deadly light. "I will not yield to you, Tiamat," he said, his voice firm. "This is my kingdom, and I will defend it with all my power." With a roar, Tiamat launched herself at Nergal, her jaw snapping as she sought to tear him apart. The chamber erupted into chaos as the battle began in earnest, the gods clashing with a force that shook the very foundations of the underworld. Nergal met Tiamat's charge with his scythe, the blade slicing through the air with a deadly precision. The two forces collided, the impact sending shockwaves through the chamber, the ground beneath them cracking and splintering as the gods fought for dominance. Ishtar moved with the grace of a dancer, her sword flashing as she struck at Kali, the goddess of destruction. The two goddesses clashed in a deadly dance, their weapons meeting with a shower of sparks as they fought for control of the battlefield. Kali's eyes burned with a fierce intensity as she matched Ishtar's every move, her hands wreathed in flames as she sought to consume her opponent. Enlil, his eyes dark with storm, faced off against Ashur, the warlord's spear gleaming with a deadly light. The two gods circled each other, their weapons raised, the air crackling with the energy of their impending clash. Enlil struck first, his spear of lightning slicing through the air with the force of a hurricane. But Ashur was quick, his spear meeting Enlil's strike with a force that sent both gods reeling. Ares, the god of war, grinned savagely as he faced Tiamat's wrath. His sword, stained with the blood of countless battles, gleamed in the dim light as he met her attack with a ferocity that matched her own. The two gods clashed with a force that shook the chamber, their weapons ringing out as they fought for control of the underworld. The battle raged on, the chamber filled with the sounds of clashing weapons and the roars of the gods. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the walls shuddering as the forces of chaos and order clashed in a struggle for dominance. The air was thick with the scent of blood and fire, the heat of the battle searing the skin of the combatants as they fought with all their strength. Tiamat, her eyes blazing with fury, coiled around Nergal, her jaw snapping as she sought to crush him in her coils. But Nergal was relentless, his scythe flashing as he struck at her, the blade slicing through her scales with a deadly precision. The two forces clashed again and again, their power shaking the chamber as they fought for control of the underworld. Ishtar and Kali moved with the speed of lightning, their weapons flashing as they struck at each other, their eyes locked in a deadly stare. The air around them crackled with energy, the flames of destruction and the fire of creation clashing in a dance of death that threatened to consume them both. Enlil and Ashur clashed with a force that sent shockwaves through the chamber, their weapons ringing out as they fought for dominance. The storm within Enlil roared to life, the winds howling as they tore at Ashur, but the warlord was relentless, his spear flashing as he struck at Enlil with a force that sent him reeling. Ares, his eyes gleaming with a savage light, met Tiamat's fury with a grin, his sword flashing as he struck at her with all his strength. The two gods clashed with a force that shook the chamber, their weapons ringing out as they fought for control of the underworld. But Tiamat, Ishtar, and Enlil were relentless. They fought with a fury that matched the storm within them, their power shaking the chamber as they clashed with Nergal and his allies. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the walls shuddering as the forces of chaos and order clashed in a struggle for dominance. The darkness within. The underworld was a place of profound silence, a void where time itself seemed to slow, where the very air was thick with the weight of forgotten memories and lost souls. This was Nergal's domain, the realm of the dead, where the god's power was absolute. Here, the shades of the departed drifted aimlessly through shadowed halls, their whispers a constant reminder of the finality of death. It was a place that had always been beyond the reach of light, where the cold grip of despair ruled over all. But now, that silence was shattered by the echoes of battle, by the roars and cries of gods locked in a struggle for dominion over the very essence of death itself. The underworld trembled as titanic forces clashed, the ancient stone of its foundations cracking under the strain of divine power unleashed. At the heart of this maelstrom, Tiamat, the ancient mother of chaos, coiled and uncoiled like a serpent of the abyss, her immense form shifting and writhing through the darkened air. Her eyes, twin orbs of burning fury, fixed upon Nergal with a hatred that had been simmering since her exile. The god of death and war stood before her, his form a shadowy silhouette against the pale, flickering light of the underworld's flames. In his hands, he gripped his scythe, a weapon forged from the very darkness that surrounded him, its blade sharp enough to sever the threads of life itself. Across the battlefield, Ares, the god of war, moved with a savage grace, his sword a blur of motion as he struck at Enlil, the god of storms and wind. The air around them crackled with electricity, the storm god's power meeting Ares' fury in a violent tempest of clashing wills. Ares fought with a brutality that knew no equal, but Enlil was relentless, his every strike calculated and precise, a force of nature that could not be easily subdued. Nearby, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, engaged Kali, the goddess of destruction. Their battle was a dance of death, a whirl of flashing blades and flaring energy. Kali, with her dark, fiery gaze, matched Ishtar blow for blow, her movements a deadly symphony of chaos and carnage. The two goddesses were evenly matched, their fury and strength locked in a deadly embrace. But the tide of battle was beginning to shift. The tides of war. Tiamat's focus was on Nergal, and her power was a storm of chaos unleashed. Her serpentine body twisted through the air, her scales shimmering with an unholy light as she lashed out at Nergal. The god of the underworld met her attack with a cold, calculating precision, his scythe slicing through the air with deadly accuracy. But Tiamat was relentless, her fury a force of nature that could not be easily contained. She struck again and again, her jaws snapping, her coils tightening around Nergal, seeking to crush him within her grasp. But Nergal was a master of death, and he moved with the ease of one who had faced countless foes in battle. He deflected her strikes with his scythe, the blade flashing as it met her scales, sending sparks flying into the dark air. But even as he fought, Nergal could feel the weight of the battle pressing down upon him. The underworld itself seemed to shudder under the strain of the conflict, the walls of his domain trembling as if in fear of the gods who sought to conquer it. He knew that he could not hold out forever against Tiamat's wrath, not when Enlil and Ishtar were beginning to gain the upper hand in their own battles. Across the battlefield, Enlil finally overcame Ashur, the warlord's spear shattering under the force of Enlil's storm. With a roar of triumph, the storm god turned his attention to Ares, his eyes blazing with the power of the tempest. Ares, sensing the shift in the battle, turned to face this new threat, his sword raised to meet Enlil's onslaught. But Enlil was not to be underestimated. He struck with the force of a hurricane, his spear of lightning flashing through the air as he drove Ares back. The god of war fought valiantly, his sword clashing against Enlil's spear with a force that sent shockwaves through the underworld. But Ares was beginning to falter, his strength waning under the relentless assault. With Ares now occupied by Enlil, Tiamat was free to focus her full fury on Nergal. She lashed out with renewed vigor, her coils tightening around the god of the underworld, her jaw snapping inches from his face. Nergal struggled to break free, his side slashing at her scales, but he could feel his strength beginning to wane. Ishtar, seeing the tide of battle turning in their favor, fought with renewed determination against Kali. The goddess of destruction was fierce, her attacks a whirlwind of chaos and fire, but Ishtar was relentless. With a cry of fury, she drove Kali back, her sword flashing with the light of 1,000 suns as she struck again and again. Kali, sensing that the battle was slipping away from her, fought with a desperate fury. But Ishtar was too strong, her power too overwhelming. With a final, devastating blow, Ishtar drove Kali to the ground, her sword raised to deliver the finishing strike. But before she could land the killing blow, Kali let out a savage scream, her body erupting in a burst of flames that forced Ishtar to retreat. The flames roared to life, filling the chamber with an intense heat that seared the very air. The final stand. The battle was reaching its climax. The three gods, Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar, now stood united, their power a force that even Nergal, Ares, and Kali could not withstand. The underworld trembled under the weight of their combined might, the very fabric of reality straining as the gods clashed in a battle that would determine the fate of the realm. Nergal, his body battered and bruised, struggled to rise from the ground where Tiamat had thrown him. His scythe lay shattered at his side, its blade broken by the force of her attack. The god of death and war was defeated, his power spent, but his eyes still burned with a fierce, unyielding resolve. Ares, his strength failing him, stumbled back from Enlil's onslaught, his sword slipping from his grasp. The god of war was a shadow of his former self, his body covered in wounds, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had fought valiantly, but even he knew that the battle was lost. Kali, her form flickering like a dying flame, stood at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes fixed on the three gods who now stood triumphant. The goddess of destruction was spent, her power drained by the fury of the battle. She knew that she could not stand against Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar, not when they were united in their desire to conquer the underworld. The three defeated gods, Nergal, Ares, and Kali, exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had given everything they had to defend their realm, but they were no match for the combined might of Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar. There was no shame in retreat, not when the alternative was certain death. With a final, defiant glare at their enemies, Nergal, Ares, and Kali turned and fled from the battlefield, their forms dissolving into the shadows of the underworld. The chamber fell silent, the echoes of their retreat lingering in the air like the final breaths of a dying world. Tiamat, her eyes blazing with triumph, watched them go, her serpentine form uncoiling as she rose to her full height. The underworld was theirs now, a kingdom to rule as they saw fit. The darkness that had once been Nergal's domain now belonged to them, a realm where their power would be absolute. Enlil, his stormy gaze fixed on the retreating forms of Nergal and his allies, let out a slow, satisfied breath. "The underworld is ours," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the chamber. "Nergal and his forces have fled, and they will not return." Ishtar, her eyes still glowing with the fire of battle, nodded in agreement. "This realm will be the foundation of our new kingdom," she said, her voice filled with determination. "A place where we will reign supreme, where we will build a new order, free from the tyranny of Marduk." Tiamat's smile was cold and triumphant. "Let this be a warning to all who would stand against us," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "We are the true rulers of the cosmos, and none shall defy us." The shadows of the future. The underworld, once a realm of death and despair, now thrummed with a new energy, a power born of the three gods who had claimed it as their own. Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar stood at the center of their new kingdom, their eyes fixed on the future that lay before them. The underworld would be the foundation of their empire, a realm from which they would launch their campaign to reclaim what had been taken from them, to reshape the cosmos according to their will. The darkness that once served as a mere shroud of death now pulsated with the promise of rebirth, a chaotic womb from which their new order would emerge. The echoes of their battle still lingered in the air, and the silent halls of the underworld seemed to tremble with the weight of what had been and what was yet to come. Tiamat, ever the ancient serpent of chaos, coiled herself upon the throne that once belonged to Nergal. The throne was carved from the bones of fallen gods, its surface cold and unforgiving, yet it fit her form perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Her eyes, glowing with the fire of victory, surveyed her new domain with a mixture of satisfaction and dark ambition. "We have taken the first step," she murmured, her voice a silken whisper that rippled through the still air. "But our work is far from finished. This kingdom is merely the beginning, a foundation upon which we will build a new empire that will stretch across the cosmos." Enlil, his stormy presence still crackling with residual energy, stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the shifting shadows that danced across the chamber's walls. The winds of his power had calmed, but they swirled restlessly around him, as if impatient for the next storm to be unleashed. "We must consolidate our power here," Enlil said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "The underworld may be ours now, but it is a realm that thrives on death, on decay. We must ensure that it bends to our will, that it serves our purposes and does not consume us in its darkness." Ishtar, radiant even in her battle-worn state, paced the chamber with a restless energy that spoke of her desire for action. Her eyes, once filled with the warmth of love, now burned with the cold fire of vengeance and ambition. She had tasted victory, and it had only sharpened her hunger for more. "The underworld will serve us well," Ishtar said, her voice carrying a fierce resolve. "But we must not linger here for too long. Our true enemy is Marduk, and he will not sit idly by while we gather our strength. He will come for us, and when he does, we must be ready to meet him with all the power at our disposal." Tiamat nodded, her gaze narrowing as she considered Ishtar's words. "Marduk will indeed come for us," she agreed, her voice low and dangerous. "But this time, we will be prepared. The underworld holds many secrets, many forgotten powers that we can harness. We will delve into its depths, uncover its darkest mysteries, and use them to forge weapons that even Marduk will fear." Enlil's eyes gleamed with dark anticipation. "The souls of the dead," he murmured, almost to himself. "They are bound to this realm, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering and despair. If we could harness their power, turn their anguish into a weapon." Ishtar's lips curled into a wicked smile. "Yes," she purred. "Imagine the despair of the dead unleashed upon the living, a force of pure torment that would tear through Marduk's forces like a plague. We could break his will, shatter his armies before they even reach us." Tiamat's eyes glinted with a fierce, predatory light. "Then that is what we shall do," she declared, her voice filled with grim determination. "We will turn the underworld into a fortress, a bastion of power that will be the envy and terror of the cosmos. And when the time comes, we will emerge from the darkness, not as exiles, but as conquerors." The underworld's awakening. The days and nights blended together in the eternal twilight of the underworld, the passage of time marked only by the relentless efforts of Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar as they set about transforming their new realm. The underworld, once a place of death and decay, began to stir with new life, or rather, a new kind of unlife. The shadows deepened, thickened, as if the very fabric of the realm was being rewoven under the hands of the three gods. Tiamat delved into the darkest corners of the underworld, where the ancient powers of chaos still lingered, untamed and raw. She communed with these forces, drawing them into herself, letting them shape her already formidable power into something even more fearsome. The serpentine goddess grew in strength, her form becoming more fluid, more terrifying, as the chaos within her body and soul blended seamlessly with the dark energies of the underworld. Ishtar focused her efforts on harnessing the energies of creation and destruction that had long been her domain. She walked among the souls of the dead, her presence a balm to some, a scourge to others. With her touch, she drew forth their latent power, weaving it into weapons and defenses that would serve their cause. Her creations were beautiful and terrible, artifacts of such potency that they seemed to pulse with their own dark life. Enlil, ever the strategist, turned his attention to the skies above the underworld. The winds that had once howled with mindless fury now bent to his will, their power harnessed and refined into something far more dangerous. He carved the air with his storms, creating barriers of lightning and thunder that would protect their realm from any who dared to challenge them. His storms were not mere tempests, they were living entities, imbued with the essence of the underworld itself. As they worked, the underworld began to change. The once barren plains of the realm now thrummed with dark energy, the ground cracking open to reveal rivers of molten fire and pits of endless shadow. The walls of Nurgle's former palace were reshaped, fortified with the bones of ancient titans and the souls of the damned, their whispers filling the air with a constant litany of suffering and despair. In the deepest reaches of the underworld, Tiamat discovered an ancient, forgotten entity, a being of pure chaos, a remnant of the primordial void from which she herself had been born. This entity, a shadow of darkness and fire, had slumbered for eons, its power undiminished by the passage of time. Tiamat, recognizing a kindred spirit, awakened the entity and bound it to her will, forging it into a weapon of unparalleled destruction. Ishtar, meanwhile, had uncovered a hidden chamber within the palace, a place where Nurgle had stored the relics of his past victories. Among these relics, she found a blade of such exquisite craftsmanship that it seemed almost alive, its edge sharp enough to cut through the very fabric of reality. This blade, she knew, would be the key to their victory over Marduk, a weapon that could pierce even the defenses of the Supreme God. Enlil, ever vigilant, had harnessed the power of the storm to create a network of watchful winds that swept across the underworld, alerting them to any intruders or threats. These winds were not merely forces of nature, they were extensions of Enlil's will, imbued with his cunning and his rage. With them, he could see and hear everything that occurred within their domain, ensuring that nothing could take them by surprise. The underworld was no longer a place of simple death and despair. It had become a fortress, a stronghold of dark power that pulsed with the energy of chaos and creation. Tiamat, Enlil, and Ishtar had remade it in their image, transforming it into a place where they could gather their strength, where they could plan their next move against Marduk.
Echoing